So a large premise of American history is that winning the Revolutionary War was a good thing, because generally winning a war is better than losing a war, generally. But would it have made a difference, honestly? Suppose we had lost the war. Would we be any different as a country today? Because Canada, really didn't have a Revolutionary War, and they seem to be independent, doing okay. And so, if we were a member of the British Commonwealth, would the United States really be that different than we are today?
I don't think we would have ever lost the war, even if French hadn't intervened. It might have gone on much longer. Washington would have gone into, he said, I will go into guerrilla warfare in the West. The British simply were incapable, as it's been pointed out, of occupying and winning the minds and hearts of the American people. So sooner or later, the British will to continue would have diminished, and they would have reached some kind of an accommodation, I believe.
Okay, and you agree with that?
So I was asked at a retirement home in Charlottesville what would have happened if the Americans had lost. And I said very flippantly, oh, you would be like Canada. And a voice I heard from the back of the room said, well, that wouldn't have been so bad. But in actual fact, that's not certain. The British made the concessions they did to Canada and Australia with the knowledge of what happened in America. But their immediate instinct after the revolution was actually to tighten control rather than to lease control. And Canada is a very different country from America, a very different view of central government, a different view of the social hierarchy.
All right. So your view is we would have won the war eventually, more or less, and if we had not won the war, and then we would have won it in 10 years, or we would have held out, eventually won.
That would be my view.
All right. Since we're being hosted by the French embassy, why don't we talk about France a moment? Could we have won the war when we won it? We eventually would have won it, you would say, but could we have won it when we won it without the help of the French?
I don't think so. I think Yorktown was crucial, and as has been pointed out, Yorktown was essentially a French victory. So that was, to end the war then, needed French help, and it needed the help of the temporary supremacy of the French Navy at the Chesapeake, and that made all the difference. So I don't think it would have ended without, at that moment, in 1781 and 3, without French intervention.
And you agree with that?
French support was critical, and not just from the time of the alliance, but from the beginning of the war.
Okay.
And I think one of the least really considered roles that France played was money.
Right.
French loans. We still don't have a good study of the actual economics of the war, but the British hoped that the revolution would go bankrupt, and it was close to doing so in 81, and Congress could not tax. But they also supplied gunpowder, which America didn't produce, and then the world's second largest navy.
But let me ask you this. France was being ruled at the time by somebody who was more despotic than King George. So why was he in favor of some people rebelling against a royal leader? Because didn't he worry that maybe it could happen to him? So why were the French so interested in seeing us win?
Well, I'm not sure that Louis XVI was as enthusiastic as the aristocracy. What's interesting and hasn't been fully developed in this conference so far is how much the aristocracy was excited about America, not because of interest, but just because of the excitement of this freedom-loving people. The French aristocracy was singing songs on behalf of liberty and equality without realizing the consequences. There was a good deal of radical chic going on, and Franklin took advantage of that. I mean, think of two examples in the 1780s. One is the Marriage of Figaro, which is based on the Beaumarchais play, mocks the aristocracy, and yet the aristocracy is going to the play, to the show. And the oath of David's painting, the Oath of Horace, 1785, is a Republican painting. Now, and the aristocracy goes to see it and celebrates it. Now, what are they thinking? I think that the French were desacralizing monarchy without realizing. This is the aristocracy that's doing this, and so the supports for the monarchy are being eroded from within.
Let's say that's true. The French didn't jump into it feet first right away. They kind of meandered to supporting us. They didn't really support us until we won at Saratoga. Is that right? They didn't really come out and say, I really want you to win. What did they do before we won in Saratoga? And what did they do later in terms of money, guns, and Navy? How much did it cost them really, and did it almost bankrupt them?
Well, they gave encouragement to American privateers. They allowed them the use of their ports. It was so open in Martinique in the Caribbean that they even had a place called the American Coffee House where all these captains of privateers would gather. Right. And they were providing, the playwright Beaumarchais, who wrote The Marriage of Figaro, created a front company called Hortelets and Co. to supply gunpowder and other needs to America. And all of this was going on before the revolution. But even more critical, it was key in the British decision not to mobilize their entire force.
I see.
Because they were worried of an arms race with France, or that France would get into the war earlier. The British hoped they could win this war quickly before France got involved.
I thought the French, maybe I'm wrong, were more interested in beating the British than they were in seeing the Americans win. I thought they wanted to get retribution for the French and Indian Wars. Is there any of that the French were really just interested in squashing the British?
Yeah, certainly, and we've heard that this morning. There was a sense of revenge for the loss in 1763 was paramount.
Right.
But the Spanish are the ones who were really frightened because they have colonies in Spain, and so they were very reluctant to get involved. But they did because they wanted loyalty to France and also to destroy Great Britain. So it's a tricky issue for the French. I think the French aristocracy, you had all these French officers willing to come, Lafayette's the most obvious example, willing to come over here and fight on behalf of the American cause.
Well, let's go back to the cause of the Revolutionary War. The colonies have been set up in the early 1600s. They're minding their own business. They're not paying taxes to the British. The British fought the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, and it cost them a lot of money. So they had this clever idea that no government had ever thought of before of actually taxing people for services that they had rendered. So why was that such a terrible idea of paying to the British some money to pay them for further protection for what had happened in the French and Indian Wars? Why was such a terrible idea?
Well, it's the Stamp Act is the crucial action, and it's the first time the British come in with a direct tax on Americans, and the implications are momentous. If Britain can come in and tax Americans directly, they would getting duties through trade, but no direct tax until the Stamp Act, and that seemed terrifying to Americans. Particularly by 1765, Americans are feeling themselves an independent people. It's almost as if they are ready to be independent. I think it's extraordinary that in a decade's time they could go from being loyal Brits to Thomas Paine's Common Sense, where they celebrate that independence. As John Adams said, they were already primed to become independent.
There was a Gallup poll, or whoever you want to say is the pollster in those days, and you voted, what would you like to do? Withdraw from our affiliation with the British, be independent, or just muddle along and kind of not have any conflicts, but not really be as dependent as we once were, the British? What would the polling data have shown?
What year are you talking about?
Well, all right, let's take 1770. Let's start with 1775.
Oh, they'd want to go.
They want to go. All right, what about 1773?
Before the Tea Act and the Coercive Acts, it would have been muddled.
Okay.
The Tea Act and the Coercive and the Tea Party were very crucial.
All right, so you think there would have been a majority of Americans in 1775 would have said, and how many Americans were there? There were 3 million Americans at the time.
2.5 or so, right. I think most the majority were patriots, and that was the British biggest mistake was underestimating or overestimating the amount of loyalists there were in the United States.
At that time, there were roughly, I thought, 3 million Americans in 1776. 500,000 were slaves.
Right.
And so you had 2.5 million white Americans. Half of those were women. So you had 1.25 million white males. Out of that, you had George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton. Now we have 320 million Americans. Where are these people now? Okay, that's a separate issue. All right. Okay, so, all right, strike that question. But okay, so in 17, the colonies come together and they say we want to have a Continental Congress. The first time that the colonies had ever come together, and I think at the time more Americans had been went to the Continental Congress had been to London than had been to Philadelphia. So what happened in the first Continental Congress that led to the Second Continental Congress and ultimately the Declaration of Independence? What did they decide to do in the first Continental Congress to try to prevent war?
Well, the big thing was the association to have an economic blockade against Britain. So it's rather strange that the early part of the war was not seen as a war of independence, but a war for the redress of grievances. And Adams was saying at the time of 1775, a third of Americans are loyal, a third neutral, and a third are patriots.
Okay.
And certainly that was changing during the war, and it still gets quoted in textbooks today, but it seems to me certainly wrong.
Okay.
But the point is 19,000 Americans fought for the British, that there was a huge element of neutrality, whatever that means, people who did not declare themselves, who did not actually engage in the war. But what part of my study is really to suggest that the American Revolution was popular, and that whenever push came to shove, people appeared from almost nowhere, even when the British Army had outnumbered them, like in Canada, as the Burgoyne marched south. By the time he got to Saratoga, he was outnumbered 4-1.
So the British showed up with some troops, and they killed some Americans at Boston and in Lexington and Concord. And did that really excite people to really say we should be independent? Were those Lexington and Concord the precipitating events?
Well, they were certainly crucial, but a year earlier there was a rumor that the British had, in 1774, had seized arms, exactly what they tried to do at Concord, and about 10,000 Minutemen from Connecticut and Western Massachusetts converged on Boston. So people were already primed. This is a year before Lexington and Concord.
So how did George Washington get the job of being the Revolutionary War general? Was it clear that we should have somebody from Virginia because it wasn't from Massachusetts?
Well, Adams certainly thought so. I mean, Virginia is by far the biggest colony and state at the time. We forget that. They had the most populous, richest, biggest in territory. As Virginia went, so did the whole country. And so it was obvious that Adams thought it was very important that it be a Virginian. And Washington shows up in his Continental Army, his militia uniform.
Yeah, I thought he showed up and said, I'm happy to do this, but I don't really want to do it, but he happened to have all of his uniforms ready. Was that true?
Well, I don't think he was saying, I want to be the commander-in-chief. I think he was saying, I'm willing to fight.
Okay.
And that was his signaling that.
So you go to the Second Continental Congress, and at that Congress there is a motion by John Adams to have the delegates go back to their states and get authority to either change the state legislatures and get authority to be independent, right? Is that how that happened?
The resolutions of May 15th, very tantamount to a Declaration of Independence. He said,
why did they have to get the delegates to go back to the states to get authority to do this? Why couldn't they just vote right then and there?
Well, there were some states that weren't all that enthusiastic, particularly New York and New Jersey were hesitant. And they want unanimity, obviously. If it had been left to John Adams, you would have had the revolution several years earlier.
All right, so they all come back around the end of June or so of 1776, and they have a vote. July 1 and July 2, they debate whether they should be independent or not. And how did that vote come out?
Well, July 2nd was the crucial vote, and Adams writes to Abigail saying, this will be our Declaration of Independence, we'll have bonfires and so on. He missed the day by 2 days because the actual formal declaration took place 2 days later.
So in anticipating the vote on July the 2nd, a committee was formed to draft some kind of document that would be a propaganda document, not a legal document. And who was on that committee to draft that document?
Well, Adams and Jefferson, Sherman, Franklin, and...
Livingston.
Livingston, that's right. But the crucial person was Jefferson. Adams was really much busier than Jefferson. Adams was chairing about 20 committees in the Continental Congress, and this young guy from Virginia had just arrived, and he hadn't got many responsibilities, and Adams said, well, you got a good hand with the pen, Mr. Jefferson, why don't you draft this? If Adams had realized how important the Declaration would turn out to be, he would never have done that. He never thought of Jefferson as the author of the Declaration of Independence. He was the draftsman, and so that was his biggest regret.
Jefferson was given about 17 days to draft it, and did he do it every day on the 17th, or did he wait till the last couple of days to draft it?
Well, as Pauline Maier, the late Pauline Maier, great historian, pointed out, he had much of his draft was changed by the Congress itself, particularly his reference to the slave trade.
So he wrote it out and he turned it in, but before there was some editing of it. Benjamin Franklin edited part of it, and the others did, and there were 3 parts to it, right? The preamble, the sins of King George, and then what we're going to do about it. And so he then puts it into the committee edits it modestly, and then on July the 2nd, when they vote to be independent, they then take up the document at the end of the 2nd, the 3rd, and the 4th. How much editing did they do of the document?
They changed about 40%. What's interesting, I think, about the document, that it's an indictment of George III. There's no mention of Parliament. Parliament had passed the Coercive Acts, had passed the Stamp Act, and yet they're scrupulous in avoiding mention of Parliament because legally they had decided that they were tied only to the Crown. By 1774-75, they no longer were under Parliament's supremacy, and so the only tie they had left to cut was to the Crown.
Now, the thing that the Continental Congress excised that was the most of concern to Thomas Jefferson was the part about King George had forced the slaves on us, slave trade. Right. Why did that get taken out?
Well, as Jefferson pointed out, I think it's Jefferson points out, there are lots of northern states that had been implicated in the slave trade, and the whole thing seemed to be an embarrassment, and they wanted to avoid that controversy.
Now, when they're debating this, Jefferson is sitting there. He never says a word about their editing. Why doesn't he say, "Hey, you're editing my great works. My words are wonderful. Why are you editing it? Why didn't he say anything?"
I don't know.
He was very bitter about it. Yeah, in fact, in his memoirs that he didn't publish during his lifetime, but he included the entire original version, which he thought much superior. He felt the editing had spoilt the document.
I thought he had sent letters to his friends saying, "Here's my version. Here's what they did. Isn't my version better?" Yeah. But he was so upset that I thought he didn't really want to take credit for it. And it was how many years later before he actually admitted he was the author of it?
Well, in the 1790s, it becomes a partisan document in the fight between the Jeffersonian Republicans and the Federalists. And he suddenly realizes, hey, this thing is very important. And that's when he begins. He writes his daughter at some point saying, this document's become very important, and therefore the desk on which I wrote, save the desk on which I wrote it, because it's going to become a relic. It's late in the game before he realizes how important it is.
He has 2 slaves with him while he's writing the Declaration of Independence. How can he have 2 slaves with him, and he has a lot of slaves back at Monticello? How can he say all men are created equal? What did he really mean by that phrase?
Boy. He and many others really believed, literally, that all men were created equal. Now, he comes to doubt this in the case of blacks, as you see in the notes on Virginia. But many other Americans really believed, as I think we still do, that we believe in nurture, not nature. That we all are a blank slate at birth, and whatever differences that emerge are due to the environment and to the experiences we go through. That was the basic premise of the Lockean premise, if you will, of the Declaration. And I think we still believe that. That's why we put so much emphasis on education. We believe that anybody can be educated to be different from what they were born.
So they agree on the text on the July the 4th. Then they go next door to Mr. Dunlop, who's a printer, and he prints up roughly, let's say, 200 copies of these documents. And these are now very famous copies of the Declaration of Independence. They're called Dunlop Copies, of which there may be 11 or something like that left. And they're worth about $25 million a piece now. And actually, I was in somebody's home recently, and I saw what I thought was a perfect Dunlop copy that had been owned by Norman Lear. And and Norman Lear had bought it for $8 million 10 years earlier, and he sold it through Sotheby's for $25 million in a private sale. And I asked the person whose house this was, is that the Dunlop copy that was owned by Norman Lear that somebody paid, you must have paid $25 million for it? The person said, no, I didn't spend that much money for it. I would remember if I did. I said, okay. The next day, I got an email from the person saying, I forgot, I did buy it. It was Bill Gates. So, if you're Bill Gates, you can $25 million, it's not that big a deal. So that Dunlop copy, a copy was sent to King George, a copy was sent to George Washington to read to the troops, a copy was sent to every state. What did King George and the British say when they got this? They say, well, we don't really like this document, or we're going to respond officially. Did they ever respond officially to it?
He never specifically mentioned it, but he did, a short while later, write about these unheard of grievances. There's no doubt he read it, because he read, just like George Washington, he loved reading newspapers. He hated the newspapers, but he would read lots of copies. He did receive all the official documents. What intrigued me is that the British government really doesn't discuss it.
Officially. But didn't they hire, I thought they hired a pamphleteer to kind of write something. Can you explain that?
Yes, loyalists and pamphleteers did respond, but in America, there's very little. There's an article in the Gentleman's Magazine ridiculing it, but there was a failure to recognize just how critical this was. And as you said, a proper document, propaganda document that would mobilize support. Right. It should be remembered it's written during wartime. There is this concern that so many are neutral, that there are loyalists, and so that especially those, the preamble, as it's known, is designed to really appeal and motivate people.
Now, Thomas Hutchinson, however, who is the premier loyalist, does write a long pamphlet analyzing the document. So that's a very important document.
He was the governor of Massachusetts?
Governor of, and probably the most notorious loyalist. And
a relative of the Olivers.
So let's go back to this. We have this document going out on July. People often get confused about how many different declarations of independence there are. There's the Dunlop copy, of which there are very few number left. But they didn't sign the declaration on July the 4th because they had to go to a printer and get it, and then they had to come back, and New York State had not yet approved the declaration, so they had to wait for New York to come back. So more or less in August they came back
and signed it.
Then that's when they came back and signed the document, right? Is that right? They came back and signed it in document then. And well, what are the British doing while this is happening? Are they sending more troops over? They're upset. And who was really running the British government, the Parliament or King George?
Well, this is when the British were landing on Staten Island and really building up a huge force to occupy New York.
Right by the Statue of Liberty, they're going by it?
And for many months, the British were victorious, to the point that in Manhattan, Washington was in such quick retreat that they played their hunting horns as if this was just a sort of a show.
Why did they need to hire German troops? I mean, the British were supposed to be the best army in the world, the biggest. How many British troops actually were in the United States, and why did they need to hire the so-called Hessians?
Well, the largest number were about 35,000. The British population is much smaller than France or Germany or Russia, so there were limits as to the size of its army, and the British themselves were suspicious of a peacetime professional army.
So they hired, how many Hessians did they hire?
And so by the end of the war, a fifth of the British army in America were Hessians.
I see, a fifth. And how many Americans actually were fighting on the American side in the Revolutionary War?
Well, it differs. At one point we had 15,000, but to meet the British threat in New York. But by December of '76, which is the time of try men's souls, the army was down to about 3,500, I think.
And were they well paid and well clothed?
No, they obviously, well, we've heard that how badly they were treated this morning, and it's a miracle that Washington was able to hold together. I mean, that was the brilliance of the move on Trenton. In the winter, to pick off that post which,
Right.
which changed everything psychologically.
Well, explain this to me. I've never really understood this. It seems like the war was fought when Marquis of Queensberry rules. You kind of settle down in the winter time. You don't fight. You just kind of stay in your camp, and you don't go surprise people generally. Why did they not fight in the wintertime? And why did they only fight in the summertime?
Well, they did fight in the wintertime, as Trenton.
But rarely.
There was a lot of partisan warfare, which they called it partisan warfare. We call it guerrilla warfare. That has not been adequately covered by historians because they aren't pitched battles. It's very difficult to put these things together. But a good deal of the fighting took place, as we would call guerrilla warfare, between militia, contrasting militia. You have that in the Carolinas. You also had it in New Jersey after Trenton. Because when Trenton occurs and Princeton, Howe pulls back all these places, and suddenly the Patriots come out of the woodwork and begin assaulting the Loyalists. It goes to show you that the Loyalists could only survive in the presence of British troops.
So in England, at what point is the Parliament saying, hey, look, we don't need these colonies anymore. Let them go. We don't really care. Who was really the one that wanted to win this war and at all costs? Was it King George, or was it the Parliament and his Prime Minister, Lord North?
King George, Lord George Germain, the Minister for America, a lot of British, what today would be called backbench MPs, the sort of regular country gentlemen, felt strongly that the war should be continued. So there was an element of real war hawks. But the reason the British ultimately have to withdraw is not because they've lost, because they still had New York, they still had parts of Georgia, St. Augustine and East Florida, Canada, and Charleston in South Carolina, was the changing mood in Parliament.
They were against the cost of it?
The House eventually just wouldn't support
I thought
the government.
Go ahead.
I think the British situation was similar to our situation in Vietnam. Right away, the British are divided. The intellectuals are opposed to the war, many of them, from the outset. So Britain is divided right from the beginning at the intellectual level.
Right.
And you've got people, the Jane Fonders of the day are opposed to the war. There are people sending contributions to the victims of Lexington and Concord. These are Brits doing that. So it's a very odd situation, and the British are constrained in what they can do because they need to win the hearts and minds of the people. So they can't conduct warfare the way Marlborough did in Bavaria at the beginning of the century, just terrorizing the people and leveling the. You can't do that if you're going to win their hearts and minds. So they're divided from the outset. The House come as peace commissioners as well as general and admiral.
When we go to grade school, when we're taught about the Revolutionary War in this country, you're often taught that King George III was crazy. He was insane and so forth. Was he insane or not?
The thinking is not, at least for the last 20 years. The assumption has been that he had porphyria, which is a hereditary blood disease, and one of the symptoms, and pardon me while you're eating, is a discolored, almost purple color urine, which one of his doctors...
Well, he was blue-blooded, so why would that be unusual?
There are now people challenging that view. The original study was a mother-son team, a medical team, and they traced this disease from Mary Queen of Scots through the royal line. What they couldn't explain is why it didn't continue after George III, because theoretically the royal family should still have this appearing. And it did open the question whether there'd been a switch of babies, if it was indeed porphyria and that Victorian come, because haemophilia starts to appear in the royal family in the 19th century.
Wasn't one of the symptoms behaving in a strange way?
Absolutely.
Right.
It had all the rambling, hysteria.
But this is
this comes after the Revolutionary War. There's no symptoms, as far as we know.
How old was he? How old was when he became the king? How old was King George?
21.
That's right.
Really, very young, because he inherits it from his grandfather.
So during the Revolutionary War, he's in his 30s,
yeah,
more or less.
Very young.
Okay, so we're going forward. The war is moving forward. George Washington's losing more battles than he's winning, but he still wins occasional battles. How did he hold the troops together, honestly, when you think about it. And did he ever give up himself, think, look, this isn't worth the aggravation factor, I'm going back to Mount Vernon?
No, he never gives up. There's a letter where he says in late 76, if I can't win battles, I will go into the West and conduct guerrilla warfare. I think he keeps his political fences mended with the Congress. He's an expert politician. He has a sense of, that's why he tries to defend New York. He knows that it's impossible. You trying to defend an island when you don't control the seaways is just madness. He knows that, but he felt that the Congress would not put up with his giving up New York City. So he makes an effort, but it's a mistake. He's very talented politically. I think that's his greatest...
Now, there's a play that some people may have heard of called Hamilton.
Yeah.
Now. Hamilton is, lionized in the play and so forth. What role did he play in the Revolutionary War? He was an aide or chief of staff to George Washington. What role did he really play?
Well, it's a minor role. He's just an aide, and he doesn't like being an aide because he's very smart. He starts as an artillery officer, and obviously Knox, who was his commander, says to Washington, hey, I got this bright young guy, and Washington's looking for bright young men to be his aides, and he brings them over, and Hamilton's frustrated. He wants a command position. He doesn't want to be in an aide. So he begs him for this command position at Yorktown, and of course Hamilton takes unbelievable risks, leading. He's the first over the redoubt, the British redoubt. He could have easily been killed right there.
So,
but he's not a major figure yet.
So while the Revolutionary War is going on, we send over Benjamin Franklin to France to kind of induce the French to do even more. So, well, how did Benjamin Franklin get along with the French? Did he speak French? Was he popular among the ladies there, or what was the story?
Brilliantly, although I should let Gordon answer because he's done a book on Franklin. But Franklin presented himself as this rural rustic. He played up the whole Enlightenment idea of the natural man. Okay. Just a wonderfully gifted diplomat, much more so than Silas Deane or John Adams, who tended, they had to be almost kept out of the way. Franklin often. The main problem with the American diplomats in Paris is there were so many of them. There wasn't just a single.
Well, they didn't trust each other. They had to have many ones watching each other. Why did they have so many diplomats?
They didn't get along, but it was one of these sort of congressional fiascos and decisions made by Congress.
So going down to Yorktown, so Mr. Cornwallis, he's the British general. Who was Mr. Cornwallis? You've written about him in your book. Explain a bit who he really was.
Well, he was the most aristocratic of all the British generals. He was, as I said earlier today, by far the least pretentious. He was very much someone who was a professional soldier. He went into the army, as did most of these aristocrats in their early teens, and the army was their life. And he spent his entire career always in a campaign mode. He said, just like Washington and Jefferson, that he'd prefer to retire and be back on his country estate. The truth was that he, in fact, was restless. He very quickly, in fact, got tired of particular commands and wanted to move on. And he died going back to India to be once again Governor General and Commander-in-Chief. Interestingly, he always insisted on both having civil and military command.
In Yorktown, how does he manage to get himself in a position where the French can come along, blockade the port, and the American troops can basically force a surrender? And why did he surrender and not just fight?
Well, it's always given as an example of British stupidity. How could he have done this? The fact is that the commanders who blamed each other, but they'd been misled by the government. So they were assured that there would be a superior British fleet at sea, which was what was meant to happen. And the commander in the Caribbean was the greatest commander at the time, who later defeated de Grasse-Rodney, and he was meant to follow up the French fleet, or better still, to intercept them in Martinique. He failed to do that, but much more significant, British intelligence had been wrong. And the other major factor was de Grasse took a huge risk, and really he should be recognized much more than Lafayette as the great French contributor to the American victory, because de Grasse made the decision not to split his fleet and to send French ships back with a convoy or to leave French ships guarding the French islands. He let the Spanish fleet guard the French islands like Martinique, which were their greatest possessions, and brought a much larger fleet up to America.
So Cornwallis decided to surrender.
Well, I think another point is that British generals regarded their men as precious. You can't afford to lose too many. And when Howe loses 40% casualties at Bunker Hill, he becomes very cautious. Those kinds of casualties are just not acceptable for British generals. And so the men were being bombarded at Yorktown.
So they put up a white flag, and then how many thousand or so troops from the British march out surrendering? Is that
about 7,000?
7,000.
There are actually two surrenders. It's less well known that there's a surrender at Gloucester Point, which is just on the other side of the Chesapeake from Yorktown, where Tarleton did a separate surrender to the French.
Did Cornwallis himself come out and march and say, I give up as well? Where was he?
Cornwallis famously did not appear. If you go to Yorktown, they show you a cave where they say he was hiding out. He said he was ill, which is very possible. He caught malaria and had been very sick. And they'd marched about 2,500 miles previously.
Where did those soldiers go? When 7,000 soldiers march out, do they give up their guns and they go to prisoner of war camp, or what happens to them?
They gave up their guns. They were so angry, and they felt the better team. When they gave up their guns, they literally threw them onto the pile so that some of them broke in the process. The person who did surrender the sword was an Irishman by the name of O'Hara, who was Cornwallis's deputy. And he tried not to surrender to the Americans, but to surrender to the French commander. This, at least, is according to the French accounts. So he went up to Rochambeau, who refused to receive the sword and pointed at Washington. He then went to Washington, who refused the sword, and Washington pointed to Benjamin Lincoln, who surrendered Charleston, and the British had not allowed him what were known as the kind of rights of war or dignities of war, and so it was Lincoln who accepted the sword.
That happens in 1781. 7,000 British soldiers give up. Why did it take until 1783 to get a treaty ending the war? What were they doing for those 2 years?
Well, you have George III, who still doesn't want to give way, as you pointed out. And there was still a large army in New York. Right. But I think the political will needed to work itself out. North knew it was over. He wants to resign all along, and it's finally.
Why did they call it the Treaty of Paris in 1783? Why not the Treaty of London or something? It was the British and the Americans who were fighting. Why is Paris? How does Paris get in the middle of it?
It was discussed and negotiated in Paris.
Okay.
And there were two treaties essentially.
So, in your collective view, if there was, who was the indispensable person for the Americans to win? Was it Adams? Was it Jefferson? Was it Franklin? Was it Washington? Who was the person that, had we not had that person, we might not have won?
Well, I think most historians believe that was Washington, that he was the man who held the army together and represented the Union. Insofar as there was a Union, he stood for it. I mean, he just had an incredible kind of reputation that he used very, very successfully at the Newburgh threat of as close as we've come to a coup d'etat, a military coup d'etat in our history, was at Newburgh in March of '83, and he headed that off. So he I think, emerges as the man.
Now, after King George hears that George Washington is going to surrender his sword himself and give up his command, what does King George say about George Washington for doing that?
Well, that was to Benjamin West. Oddly, George III's favorite artist was American from Pennsylvania. And according to West's memoirs, George III was having yet another portrait done when West told him that Washington had simply given up his command at Francis Tavern. And George III said, if that is the case, then he is indeed a very great man. Washington is a good example of the role and importance of the individual in history. When you consider the people who were thought of as commanders instead of him, whether it was Hancock at the beginning of the war, Charles Lee, who was known as Boiling Water Lee by the Indians and could never have managed the diplomacy with Congress, or Horatio Gates, who fled 250 miles from the battlefield at Camden.
Well, all his predecessors, when you go back to Cromwell and Marlborough, and then later Napoleon, they all expected political rewards commensurate with their military achievements, not Washington. He's going back. That's why they invoked the Cincinnatus image.
After the war, eventually, Adams and Jefferson have a chance to meet King George. So what was that meeting like? Was King George very gracious? Frosty.
Yeah.
I know Adams had a very good meeting with George III, but there's no public account of it at the time. Jefferson, in his memoir, said that George III had been just very rude, but he didn't go into details. Adams' grandson said that George III showed his back to them. And the reason would be not that Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. George III is unlikely to have known that in the 1780s, but that Jefferson was known to be so pro-French. And one of the first comments that George III made to John Adams when he presented his credentials was, "I gather that unlike some of your fellow countrymen, you're not that predisposed to the country of France." And Adams was incredibly embarrassed by this and hesitated and then said, "My only allegiance is to my own country." And George III said, "A good man has no other allegiance."
So how many soldiers, Americans, were killed in the Revolutionary War?
The best estimate we have is 25,000 deaths. Now that's 1% of the population, of 2.5 million. That's enormous. That's the greatest loss in our history. Except for the Civil War, where both sides were Americans, but we've never lost that percentage of people. So this was a searing event that ran through the whole society. Everybody, in one way or another, was affected by.
How many British were killed?
Not as many in America, but if you look at the worldwide war, the Caribbean especially, the life expectancy was about 3 years, and it had very little to do with war and everything to do with the climate. So entire regiments disappeared there.
And we didn't really cover, you mentioned briefly Lafayette. Why is Lafayette considered such a great hero in, let's say, the United States? What did he actually do that helped us win the war?
I think it's partly he's the young romantic.
He's 19 when he comes here.
And dedicated, and so dedicated genuinely to the cause. And he was such a favorite of Washington and so visible.
And he pays his own way, which is another.
Yes, he contributes money. And he did play an important role in Virginia. And Washington initially couldn't get to Virginia to oppose Cornwallis's advance. Cornwallis basically had no army opposing him when he got into Virginia, other than Lafayette, who, with a much smaller force, successfully gave him the runaround.
So we wrap this up, and just a final question for both of you. What would you like people here to know, take away from here about the Revolutionary War, and what would you like students, young students in our country to know about the Revolutionary War? If you're going to summarize why it's so important and what people here should remember about it and what students should know about it, what's the most important thing that you think they should know?
Well, of course, there's the larger revolution of which the war is just a part, but I think the extent of sacrifice, I think most students don't realize just how many people died, what that might have meant for families. It was the longest war in our history until Vietnam, and the losses were the greatest we've ever had, with the exception of the Civil War. So an appreciation of what it cost these people and how important the revolution as a whole is to us Americans, because it created not only legally created the United States, but creates all of our values, liberty, equality, which are the only adhesives we have as a nation. So I think an appreciation of the revolution as a whole, of which the war was a searing experience, is important for every American.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm certainly that it was a civil war, that it was not supported by all
Right.
Americans, that some really lose from this, like the Native Americans who essentially choose the wrong side. But obviously the point of my work was really to say that the Americans were fighting not a B team sent over from Britain, but their best commanders, and it was a remarkable victory, even given the problems of the British in terms of waging this war.
Is this story true or not? Final question. It is said that John Adams, as you pointed out, wrote a letter to Abigail saying, we will remember July the 2nd forever because this is the day we voted to be independent. But we celebrate July the 4th, not July the 2nd. Some people say it's because when July the 2nd, 1777 came around, they were busy working in the Continental Congress. They forgot it was July the 2nd. They said, oh, we got to organize it. We'll get it organized on the 4th. And that's why we celebrate the 4th. Is that true or not?
I've never heard that story.
Never heard that.
No.
Okay. All right. So why do we celebrate the 4th and not the 2nd?
Well, that was the formal vote on the Declaration
Okay.
of Independence.
Thank you all very much for a very interesting conversation.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.